Greeting from Canner Talk of Omaha. Among theologians, Catherine Tanner stands out as different. She is not a dead male, but a very alive woman. Moreover, she is an Episcopalian from that small church of ours that has not over the course of its 230 years been noted for producing theologians. She is, I think, rather reserved about her own biography. Briefly, let me say that she was born in 1957, grew up in the Midwest, went to Yale. She continued her studies at Yale, finally earning a PhD in theology. She began her teaching and writing career at Yale. At some point, she accepted a call to the Dorothy Grant McClure Professorship of Theology at the University of Chicago, one of the top positions in the country for a theologian. Then she was called by Yale to return to the Frederick Marquand Professor of Systematic Theology. This included the dual appointment to Berkeley Divinity School, our own Episcopal seminary at Yale as well, where she has continued to work and write to this day. She is, in a sense, largely unknown. I became aware only over a year ago, even though I was, as our rector and bishop, a graduate of Berkeley Divinity School. On the other hand, she is well known and highly regarded among Catholic and Protestant academic theologians across the country. This has something to do with the disconnect between academic theology and the life of the local congregation. We are likely to take this for granted, but this has not always been the case. In the 1960s, for example, Paul Tillich, that evangelical Reformed systematic theologian that immigrated from Germany to the United States, appeared on the cover of Time magazine, as did a number of other international theologians like Barth, Rahner, Kuhn, and Panningberg. As those whom I have named above, she is a systematic theologian. Amid her copious writings, 3 volumes form the complete systematic theology. They are God and Creation and Christian Theology, Christ the Key, and the Politics of God, Christian Theology and Social Justice. The first volume identifies the fundamental elements of God Talk, Part 1, which he then carries on through the historical incident of God, Christ and the Church, Part 2, and then ends up with the meaning of human behavior, Ethics, Part 3. This tripart division is the classic shape of a systematic theology, for example, Paul Tillich's. The systematic theologian is, in some senses, a theologian's theologian. That raises the question of what Tanner can mean for a non-theologian. That would be you and me. Tanner provides us with some help. She makes a distinction between first-order thinking to God talk, first-order God talk, and second-order God talk. First-order God talk is what we do when we preach, teach, write a poem, or visit with a neighbor when some circumstances has given rise to the question of God. The content of what we will say in the first-order speaker, as first-order speakers, will come out of our participation in the living tradition of the church, and it will be developed by our intuition. Second order God talk, what theologians do, particularly ones who aspire to systematic theology, comes out of the same living tradition, but in this case it has been developed by the rigorous means of reason. Notice that in her distinction she puts you first. That is, she respects the first order speaker and does not take their responsibility away from them. She does not want you to talk theology. What the second order God talk is concerned to do, what she's concerned to do for us, is to provide us with the means of speaking coherently about God. At first, this might seem to be an unnecessary preoccupation, but let me give you an example. In visiting with a friend, you are moved to say something like, well, just hand your problems over to God. Your friend will initially be quite impressed with your faith, but upon thinking about it, they will remember that you are a proactive person who is always preoccupied with making things turn out right. It's a contradiction. Witness has failed. Or take a second example. You are in a more modest mood, and you respond to a question, why do you believe in God? And you say, oh, for me, it is a great mystery. I can't put it in words, I just do. This is choosing the way of silence. Witness did not happen. Maybe we Episcopalians are more prone to the latter than to the former. Tanner's aim as a theologian is not simply to help us be coherent, but also to help us be more fluent. In the beginning of her systematic in God and creation, she provides two basic rules for God talk. God talk does not follow from contrasting and comparing. For example, it is argued that God is the first cause. This has been arrived at by taking cause, which is something we know about from our experience, and then contrasting the way that God is different as a cause. He is unique, being the first cause, the unmoved mover. That sounds pretty good, except it fails to establish the true transcendent God. We are left with a God at a distant end of a line of causes, and we have in effect removed God from our present reality. The second rule of God talk is that a speaker must assume that God's creative agency is immediate and universal. This rejects the common solution in God talk of occasionalism. This position claims that on occasion God has or will act in a simple, unequivocal way. For instance, he once parted the Red Sea. In reality, the divine act is always parting the Red Sea, even now in your own prayer life. Here's another example. Suppose I'm frantically looking for a parking place in downtown Omaha. Please, God. And wow, a miracle, God came through. From these considerations come another corollary. God's agency does not compete with human efficacy. Suppose we are in the parlor having a discussion about prayer, and our speaker is making the point that we should be open to praying for anything, not trying to save it up for the big things or the right things. You notice that the room is growing dark. Should you pray that the lights come on? By all means. But God's response to your prayer works through moving a human actor who turns on the light. I like to think of this as a parallel spheres of operation. Visualize a sheet of paper held vertically. On this side, we operate by means of tracing lines from point A to point B. On the other side is the presence of God, immediately available to any given point on the paper, A, B, and so forth. God's immediate universal agency never steps through the paper onto our side of the surface, which is the sphere of our human efficacy. And yet you see there is this intimate involvement, but never a competition. The radical transcendence of God, which Tanner commends to us, may be experienced as a loss. There's a story about one of the ancient church fathers who was explaining the Creed of Nicaea to a group of people who had gathered together. And he's emphasizing God's transcendence as he does so. In the audience is a poor monk of the desert, of whom it is said, upon hearing the teaching of the Father, suddenly arose and fled the room, crying out, "They've taken away my God's hands and his feet." In price of any loss that you might feel, however, you will receive the availability of the immediate experience of God at all times and in all places at the heart of your prayer life. That, I would say, is a pretty good trade-off. We call this the gift of theology. As we leave our discussion today, it occurs to me that the next question about Tanner for us is, in what sense is she an Anglican theologian? That would make a very interesting discussion for us on another day. Thank you for your time this evening.